The morning sun cast long shadows across the road as James Wilson carefully backed his old blue Buick out of his driveway. He adjusted his glasses and checked his watch, 9:15 a.m., right on schedule for his weekly Veterans Support Group meeting downtown. At 72 years old, James was a man of routine and respect, qualities that had served him well during his 30 years in the Air Force. James hummed along to the soft jazz playing on the radio as he drove. The familiar melody reminded him of his late wife Loretta, who had always loved this song. The thought brought a small smile to his weathered face. 3 years since she passed, and not a day went by that he didn't miss her laugh. The Veterans Center parking lot was already half full when James arrived. He nodded at Frank, the security guard who always saved him a spot near the entrance because of his bad knee. Inside, the meeting room buzzed with conversation. 20 men and women of different ages, races, and military branches, all bound by their service. "Colonel's here," called out Thomas, a young Gulf War veteran who had been struggling with nightmares. The room didn't quiet completely. They weren't in the military anymore, but several people shifted to make space for James in the circle. "Don't get up on my account," James said with a wave of his hand, but he appreciated the gesture. These weekly meetings had become the highlight of his retirement years. For the next 2 hours, James listened more than he spoke. A new member, a woman who had served in Afghanistan, shared her story of coming home to find her husband had left and taken their kids. James noticed how her hands trembled as she spoke, and when the meeting ended, he approached her. "First time's always the hardest," he told her, his voice gentle but firm. "But you showed up, and that's what counts. Took me nearly a year after Vietnam before I could talk about what I saw over there." The woman, Lisa was her name, looked up at him with tired eyes. "Does it get easier?" James didn't lie to her. "Not easier. Different. You learn to carry it better." She nodded, understanding what he meant without needing more words. That was something civilians often didn't get. How much could be said between veterans without saying much at all? After helping to stack the chairs and promising to bring his famous lemon cookies next week, James headed to his car. He checked his phone and saw a text from his grandson Dwayne, asking if they were still on for fishing this weekend. James smiled and sent back a thumbs-up emoji, one of the few he knew how to use. The drive home took him through downtown, past the community center where he volunteered teaching chess to kids 3 afternoons a week. James took the long route today, enjoying the perfect spring weather. His neighborhood had changed over the 40 years he'd lived there. More apartment buildings, fewer family homes, but he still waved at Mrs. Patterson watering her roses and humped at old Mr. Rivera sitting on his porch. James thought about stopping for groceries but decided tomorrow would be soon enough. His knee was starting to ache, a sure sign of rain coming despite the clear blue skies. As he turned onto Maple Street, he mentally planned the rest of his day, a sandwich for lunch, then some time working on his memoir. The grandkids had been after him for years to write down his stories, especially about his time as one of the first black squadron leaders in his unit. He didn't notice the police car parked at the corner until he had already passed it. In his rearview mirror, he saw it pull out, but thought nothing of it. James was always careful to drive exactly at the speed limit, a habit from decades of military precision. He turned onto his street, already thinking about which stories he would work on this afternoon. The sudden flash of blue lights behind him came as a complete surprise. James frowned, checking his speedometer out of habit. He'd been going 3 miles under the limit. Maybe a taillight was out. He carefully signaled and pulled over to the right, turning down his radio and reaching for his wallet in his back pocket. As he waited for the officer to approach, James had no idea that the next few minutes would change not just his life, but his entire community. James took a deep breath as he watched the police officer in his side mirror. He'd been pulled over maybe 3 times in his entire life, and each time had been for something minor, a broken taillight once, and twice for registration renewals. He'd been a few days late on. Nothing serious. Still, his heart picked up its pace a little. Old habits from decades ago, when getting pulled over as a black man could mean trouble, no matter how respectful you were. Just stay calm, he told himself, placing both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. The training he'd given his own sons and grandsons over the years echoed in his head. Be polite, move slowly, keep your hands visible. The officer took his time getting out of the patrol car. Through his mirror, James could see him adjusting his hat, then his belt. Finally, the young officer approached, walking with a stiff swagger that reminded James of fresh lieutenants trying too hard to look important on their first day of command. License and registration, the officer demanded before he'd even reached the window fully. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. "Good afternoon, officer," James said anyway, his voice steady and respectful. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer, Hughes, according to his nameplate, stared down at James with narrowed eyes. "You were speeding. License and registration now." His hand rested casually on his holster, a gesture James didn't miss. "I'm certain I wasn't speeding, sir. I always drive carefully, especially in residential areas," James replied, still keeping his tone even. "But I'll get my information for you. My registration is in the glove compartment and my license is in my wallet. I'm going to reach for them now, all right?" Officer Hughes scoffed. "Just hurry it up, old man. Some of us have real work to do today." The disrespect stung, but James had dealt with worse. He carefully opened the glove compartment and retrieved his registration, then slowly reached for his back pocket to get his wallet. His fingers, stiff from arthritis, fumbled slightly with the leather fold. "Today, Grandpa," Hughes said with an exaggerated sigh. "You people are always so slow following simple instructions." James froze for a moment at the comment. "You people." Those two words carried weight, carried history. He looked up at the young officer, really seeing him now. The impatient tapping of his foot, the dismissive curl of his lip, the contempt in his eyes. "I'm moving as quickly as I can, officer," James said, finally handing over his license and registration. "I served 30 years in the United States Air Force. Respect has always been important to me." Hughes barely glanced at the documents before snorting. "Yeah, right, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Step out of the vehicle." "Excuse me?" James asked, genuinely confused. "Is there a problem with my documentation?" "I said step out of the vehicle." Now, Hughes stepped back and put his hand more firmly on his holster. "I need to make sure you're not hiding anything in here." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. This wasn't about speeding. This was something else entirely. Still, he followed the instruction, carefully opening his door and standing up, his bad knee protesting the sudden movement. "Stand over there," Hughes ordered, pointing to the sidewalk. James complied, watching as the officer began to search his car without explanation. A few cars drove by slowly, drivers turning their heads to watch. A woman walking her dog across the street slowed down, then stopped completely, pulling out her phone. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong," James said, his dignity intact despite the growing humiliation of being made to stand like a criminal on the street where he'd lived for 4 decades. "If you tell me what you're looking for, perhaps I can help you." "Shut up," Hughes snapped, emerging from the car. "Where'd you get this vehicle?" "How'd you pay for it?" "It's my car, officer. Paid off years ago." "Sure it is," Hughes said with a smirk. "And where'd you really get the money for it? Don't look like the kind of car someone from your neighborhood should be driving." James stood straighter, his military bearing returning despite his age. "Young man, I purchased this vehicle with money I earned serving this country. I was a colonel in the Air Force and I don't care if you were the King of England," Hughes interrupted, stepping closer until he was looming over James. "Around here, you're just another." He never finished his sentence. The sound of another police car pulling up cut him off mid-thought. Both men turned to see who had arrived, and James felt a small measure of relief as he recognized the vehicle. Perhaps now this situation would finally make sense. The second police car pulled up smoothly to the curb, its engine cutting off with a soft purr. James stood tall despite the ache in his knee, his military training still evident in his posture even after all these years. Officer Hughes turned toward the newcomer, his expression shifting from arrogance to something less certain. A woman stepped out of the vehicle, trim, professional, with 3 stars on her collar. Even from a distance, James could see the authority she carried, not from her uniform, but from the confidence in her walk. Officer Hughes straightened his back, suddenly looking like a schoolboy caught misbehaving. "What's going on here, Hughes?" she asked, her voice clear in the afternoon air. "Just a routine traffic stop, Chief Martinez." This man was speeding through the neighborhood. Hughes replied, his tone completely different from how he'd spoken to James moments before. Chief Martinez looked from Hughes to James, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Colonel Wilson, is that you?" James felt a rush of relief. He recognized her now. They'd met at the Veterans Day ceremony last fall, where she presented him with a community service award for his work with troubled youth. "Yes, Chief Martinez. Good to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Hugh's eyes darted between them, the realization dawning on his face. "You two know each other?" Martinez ignored him, walking over to James instead. "Are you all right, Colonel? What seems to be the problem here?" Before James could answer, a small crowd had begun to gather. Neighbors James had known for years stood watching from their lawns. Mrs. Patterson had abandoned her roses. Mr. Rivera had managed to walk down from his porch with his cane. A couple of teenagers on bikes had stopped to watch, phones already recording the scene. "I was driving home from my veterans group when Officer Hughes pulled me over, claiming I was speeding," James explained calmly. "I wasn't. Then he ordered me out of my car and began searching it without explanation. When I mentioned my military service, he mocked me." Chief Martinez's expression hardened. She turned to Hughes. "Is this true?" "Ma'am, I was just following protocol for suspicious vehicles in the area," Hughes said, his earlier confidence vanishing. "There was a report of—" "There was no report," Martinez cut him off. "I monitor all patrol assignments. This street wasn't on today's watch list." She looked back at James's car, noting its well-maintained condition and the veteran's license plate. And what exactly was suspicious about Colonel Wilson's vehicle? Hughes opened his mouth, then closed it again. The crowd had grown larger, with people murmuring among themselves. Someone called out, "That's how he always treats folks from this neighborhood." Another voice added, "I got it all on video, Chief. The whole thing." James stood quietly, aware of the eyes on him. He'd faced discrimination before, as a young man in the 1960s, as the only black officer in his early units, as a civilian in places where people saw his skin before they saw his medals. But there was something particularly painful about facing it here, on his own street, in front of neighbors who respected him. "Chief Martinez," he said softly, "I don't want to make a scene. I'd just like to go home now." She shook her head, her expression gentle but firm. "I'm afraid it's too late for that, Colonel. A scene has already been made, and not by you." She turned to Hughes. "Officer, return to your vehicle and wait for me there. We'll discuss this situation back at the station." Hughes hesitated, looking as if he might argue, but something in Martinez's expression stopped him. He nodded stiffly and walked back to his patrol car. Martinez turned back to James. "I'm deeply sorry about this, Colonel Wilson. This is not how we train our officers to behave." James nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. "I know that, Chief. I've worked with your department on the youth outreach program. Most of your officers are good people." The crowd had started to drift closer, neighbors coming to stand near James in a silent show of support. Thomas from the veterans group had somehow heard what was happening and arrived, parking his motorcycle haphazardly at the curb. A local news van had pulled up at the end of the block. Martinez noticed it too. "Colonel, this is likely to get more attention than either of us wanted. Would you be willing to come down to the station to make a formal statement?" "Not today," she added quickly, seeing the wariness in his eyes. "Tomorrow, perhaps. This needs to be addressed properly." James looked around at the faces of his community, concerned, angry, supportive. He thought about all the young men he'd mentored over the years, teaching them how to navigate a world that sometimes judged them unfairly. What would he tell them to do in this situation? "Yes," he said finally. "I'll come in tomorrow. This needs to be addressed, not just for me, but for everyone." By the next morning, everyone in town seemed to know what had happened on Maple Street. James woke up to his phone ringing. His grandson Dwayne called first, his voice tight with anger. "Grandpa, you're all over social media. There's videos everywhere. Why didn't you call me yesterday?" "No need to worry you," James said, sitting up in bed and reaching for his glasses. "It's being handled." "Being handled?" Dwayne's voice rose. "Grandpa, people are furious. Mrs. Patterson's daughter posted a video that's got like 20,000 shares already. You can clearly hear that cop talking down to you." After reassuring Dwayne he was fine, James hung up and slowly made his way to the kitchen. 3 more calls came while he was making his coffee. Thomas from the veterans group, his neighbor Mr. Rivera, and Lisa, the new veteran from yesterday's meeting. News traveled fast. James was buttering his toast when a knock came at the door. He wasn't surprised to find 2 reporters standing on his porch, notepads in hand. "Colonel Wilson, we'd like to get your statement about yesterday's incident with Officer Hughes." James shook his head politely. "I'll be making my official statement at the police station this afternoon. That's all I have to say for now." He closed the door gently and went back to his breakfast, but the peace didn't last long. His phone kept ringing with calls from friends, family, and numbers he didn't recognize. By 10 o'clock, he decided to turn it off completely. At noon, James put on his best suit, the navy blue one he wore to important occasions. He pinned his service medals to the lapel, not out of vanity but as a reminder of who he was, of what he stood for, of the country he had served. As he straightened his tie in the mirror, he thought about all the times in his life when he had to stand tall in difficult moments. His doorbell rang again as he was putting on his shoes. This time it was Chief Martinez, not in her uniform but in civilian clothes. "I thought you might like a ride to the station," she said. "There's quite a crowd gathering there." James nodded gratefully. "That's thoughtful of you, Chief." As they drove, Martinez kept her eyes on the road, but her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Colonel, I want you to know that what happened yesterday, it's not acceptable. Not in my department." "I know that," James said. "One officer doesn't represent all of you." "But he does represent a problem that needs fixing," she replied. "The videos are everywhere this morning. The mayor's been calling me every hour. The press is camped outside the station." James looked out the window at the familiar streets of his town. "What will happen to Officer Hughes?" Martinez sighed. "He's on administrative leave pending a full investigation, but between you and me, with the video evidence and witness statements, his career with our department is over." They turned a corner, and James could see the police station ahead. And the crowd gathered in front. Signs bobbed above people's heads. "Justice for Colonel Wilson," and "End police racism now," and "Respect our veterans." There must have been 200 people standing shoulder to shoulder. "I didn't want this," James said quietly. "All this attention." Martinez pulled into a reserved parking space behind the building. "I know you didn't, but maybe it needed to happen. Maybe the town needed something to rally around." Inside, the station was buzzing with activity. Officers stopped what they were doing when James walked in, many of them nodding respectfully or coming over to shake his hand. He recognized several who had helped with his youth chess program or veterans outreach events. Martinez led him to a conference room where the mayor waited, along with 2 town council members and the police department's legal counsel. The mayor rushed forward, hand extended. "Colonel Wilson, on behalf of the entire town, I want to express our deepest apologies for what happened yesterday." James shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that, Mayor, but I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to make sure something good comes from this situation." Before they could sit down, the door opened again. A young officer, James recognized him as Officer Reynolds, who sometimes volunteered at the community center, stepped in. "Excuse me, Chief Mayor," he said nervously, "but there's someone else here who wants to speak with Colonel Wilson." He hesitated. "It's Officer Hughes. He's asking if he can apologize in person." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to James. "He's here by his own choice?" James asked. "No one ordered him to come." "No, sir," Reynolds replied. "He showed up about 10 minutes ago. Said he couldn't sleep all night thinking about what he did." James thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'll speak with him." The mayor looked alarmed. "Colonel, you don't have to do that. Your statement alone is enough for our investigation." "I know I don't have to," James said, his voice steady. "But I want to. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most important ones." Officer Hughes looked nothing like the confident, swaggering man who had pulled James over yesterday. His shoulders slumped, dark circles hung under his eyes, and he couldn't seem to look directly at anyone in the room. When James entered the small meeting room where Hughes waited, the young officer stood up quickly, almost knocking over his chair. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for agreeing to see me." James took a seat across from him, taking his time to settle himself. Chief Martinez stood by the door, her arms crossed, watching carefully. The mayor had wanted to come too, but James had asked for some privacy, just him, Hughes, and the chief. "Why did you want to see me, Officer Hughes?" James asked, his voice neither harsh nor gentle, just steady. Hughes swallowed hard. "I came to apologize, sir. What I did yesterday," he paused, struggling for words. "It was wrong. Completely wrong." "Yes, it was," James agreed simply. He didn't rush to make Hughes feel better, didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. "I've been on the force for 6 years," Hughes continued, "and I can't say this was my first time acting that way. But seeing those videos last night, hearing my own voice," he shook his head. "I didn't recognize myself. Or maybe I finally did, and I didn't like what I saw." James studied the younger man's face. "What did you see when you pulled me over yesterday? Before you knew who I was? Be honest." The question hung in the air between them. Hughes looked down at his hands. "I saw," he started, then stopped. "I saw what I expected to see. An old black man in a neighborhood where I thought he didn't belong. In a car I thought he shouldn't be able to afford." His voice grew quieter with each word. "I didn't see you, sir. I saw all these assumptions I was carrying." Outside the room, the station buzzed with activity. Through the window, James could see protesters still gathered, their signs visible from where he sat. His phone, which he turned back on before arriving, had 62 missed calls. "Do you know why I agreed to talk with you today?" James asked. Hughes shook his head. "Because 30 years ago I had a young airman under my command. White kid from a small town who'd never really known any black people before joining up. He made some comments, used some language that wasn't appropriate. His fellow airmen wanted him disciplined, transferred out." James leaned forward slightly. "Instead, I sat him down for a conversation not unlike this one." "What happened to him?" Hughes asked. "He went on to become one of the finest officers I ever worked with, eventually made colonel himself." James allowed himself a small smile. "He told me, years later, that our talk changed the course of his life. Not because I lectured him or punished him, but because I gave him the chance to see me as a person, not a category." Hughes nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "You think I can change?" "I think we all can," James replied. "The question is, do you want to?" For the first time since James had entered the room, Hughes looked him directly in the eyes. "Yes, sir, I do." Chief Martinez cleared her throat. "Officer Hughes has agreed to undergo extensive sensitivity training. He's also volunteered for community service, real service, not just checking a box." "That's a start," James acknowledged. "But I have another suggestion." He turned back to Hughes. "The youth center where I teach chess 3 days a week, they're always short on volunteers. Young people, especially those from troubled backgrounds, need to see officers as people they can trust, not fear. Would you be willing to put in some time there?" Hughes blinked in surprise. "You want me around those kids? After what I did?" "Not immediately," James clarified. "But eventually, yes. Real change doesn't happen in training rooms. It happens in relationships." A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Reynolds poked his head in. "Excuse me, but the press is getting restless out front. The mayor's asking if you'll be making a statement soon, Colonel." James nodded and stood up, his knees cracking slightly. "I should go speak to them." As he moved toward the door, Hughes called after him. "Colonel Wilson?" James paused, looking back. "Why are you being so decent about this?" Hughes asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Most people would want me fired, maybe even charged. You have every right to be angry." James thought for a moment before answering. "Son, I've seen what anger does to people over the long haul. I've seen what happens when justice gets confused with vengeance." He straightened his tie. "Besides, I didn't serve this country for 30 years so things could stay the same. I did it hoping they would get better." The steps of the police station were crowded with reporters, community members, and curious onlookers. When James emerged through the front doors, a hush fell over the gathering. Cameras flashed. Microphones appeared, thrust toward him like eager hands. Behind him stood Chief Martinez, the mayor, and several other officials. James approached the makeshift podium someone had set up. He'd never sought the spotlight, had always been more comfortable giving orders on a military base than speaking to crowds, but he'd faced scarier situations than this. "Good afternoon," he began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd without need for much amplification. "My name is James Wilson. Yesterday, I experienced something on the street where I've lived for 40 years that no citizen should experience anywhere." A reporter called out, "Will you be filing a lawsuit against the department?" James shook his head. "I'm not here to talk about lawsuits. I'm here to talk about something more important, how we move forward as a community." From the corner of his eye, James could see Thomas and several other veterans from his support group standing to the side, nodding encouragingly. Mrs. Patterson waved from the edge of the crowd. "What happened to me was wrong," James continued. "But focusing only on one officer or one incident misses the bigger picture. This isn't just about me or Officer Hughes. It's about patterns and systems that need changing." The crowd had grown quieter, people leaning in to catch his words. "I just had a conversation with Officer Hughes," James said. This caused a stir, whispers spreading through the gathering. It was a difficult conversation, but an important one. And it's the first of many conversations this town needs to have. A young woman with a local newspaper badge stepped forward. "Colonel Wilson, do you think Officer Hughes should keep his job?" James took a moment before answering. "That's not my decision to make. But I do believe in accountability. I also believe in the possibility of growth and change. Otherwise, what are we working toward?" Chief Martinez stepped up beside him. "If I may add something," she said. James nodded and stepped aside. "The incident involving Colonel Wilson has brought to light issues within our department that can no longer be ignored," Martinez stated firmly. "Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory body cameras for all officers. We're also establishing a civilian oversight committee to review police practices and complaints." The crowd responded with approving murmurs and some applause. James noticed a group of young officers in the back, watching intently. Some looked uncomfortable, others relieved. The mayor moved to the microphone next, announcing the formation of a community task force on policing, with James invited to serve as a key advisor. As the officials continued outlining their plans, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Lisa, the female veteran from his support group. "This is why we all respect you so much, Colonel," she said quietly. "You turn problems into opportunities." James smiled slightly. "Just trying to make sure something good comes from something bad." After the press conference ended, James found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. People wanted to shake his hand, take photos with him, tell him their own stories. Young people asked how they could get involved in the changes being proposed. Older residents thanked him for speaking up. As the crowd began to disperse, James spotted his grandson Dwayne making his way through the thinning group. The young man wrapped him in a tight hug. "Grandpa, that was amazing. You were all over the news, even national channels. Everyone at my job was talking about it." James patted his grandson's back. "It's not about the attention, Dwayne." "I know," Dwayne said, pulling back to look at his grandfather. "But you know what? A bunch of guys from my work want to come to your chess program now. They're saying they never knew we had a war hero teaching kids in our neighborhood." James chuckled. "I was never a hero, just did my job." "Well, you're my hero," Dwayne said simply. "Always have been." Walking slowly back to Chief Martinez's car for a ride home, James reflected on the day's events. This wasn't how he planned to spend his retirement years, becoming the face of police reform in his small town. But then, life rarely followed the plans you made. As they drove past the community center, James noticed a group of children playing outside. They waved excitedly when they recognized him in the car. These were the kids from his chess program, the future of this community. James waved back, thinking about the work ahead. "You know," he said to Martinez, "I think I'd like to start that civilian oversight committee sooner rather than later. Time doesn't stand still, and neither should progress." Martinez nodded. "I think that's a fine idea, Colonel. A very fine idea indeed." 6 months passed quickly. Summer faded into fall, and the maple trees that gave James's street its name turned brilliant shades of red and gold. The incident that had shaken their community hadn't been forgotten, but it had changed them in ways no one could have predicted. On a crisp October morning, James sat at his usual spot in the community center, chessboards set up before him. His Tuesday chess club had grown from 8 children to nearly 30, with a waiting list for more. Parents who'd never set foot in the center before now volunteered regularly. The room buzzed with the sound of children contemplating their next moves. "Check," said a small girl with bright eyes, moving her bishop with confidence. James studied the board and smiled. "Well done, Tanya. Very well done." The door opened and Officer Hughes entered, carrying a box of donuts as he did every week now. The children called out greetings, not Officer Hughes but Coach Brad, the name they'd given him after he started helping with the center's basketball program. Hughes set the box down and caught James's eye, giving him a respectful nod. The younger man looked different these days, the rigid swagger gone, replaced by something more genuine. He still had a lot to learn, but he was trying. That counted for something. "Colonel, don't forget about the town hall meeting tonight," Hughes reminded him. "How could I?" James replied with a chuckle. "My phone's been buzzing all morning with reminders." The meeting would be the final presentation of the Police Oversight Committee's recommendations, 6 months of work culminating in a comprehensive plan for reform. James had chaired the committee, bringing together diverse voices from across the community. What had started as a response to one ugly incident had grown into something much bigger. Later that afternoon, James sat in his living room getting ready for the meeting. He carefully pinned his medals to his jacket, not all of them, just the ones that mattered most to him. His Distinguished Service Medal, his Bronze Star, and the newly added civilian honor the governor had presented him with last month for his community work. The doorbell rang. James opened it to find Lisa standing there, now a regular visitor. She'd become something of a protege, taking over some of the Veterans Support Group responsibilities as James focused more on the Oversight Committee. "Ready for the big night, Colonel?" she asked, offering her arm for support. His knee had been giving him more trouble lately. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, locking his front door behind them. They drove to the high school auditorium where the meeting would be held. The parking lot was already full, cars spilling onto the grass. Inside, the space hummed with conversation as hundreds of people found seats. Chief Martinez spotted him entering and came over immediately. "Full house tonight," she said. "Word got around. We've even got people from neighboring towns here to see what we've accomplished." James nodded, taking in the diverse crowd. "It's a good start." "More than a start," Martins corrected him. "The body camera program has already reduced complaints by 40%. Training evaluations are up. Community trust surveys show improvement across every neighborhood." The mayor joined them, clipboard in hand. "And we just got word this afternoon. The State Police Academy wants to use our oversight model as a training case study. They're calling it the Wilson Protocol." James shook his head, embarrassed by the attention. "I didn't do much. Just asked some questions that needed asking." "You did a lot more than that," a voice said behind him. James turned to find Officer Hughes standing there in his dress uniform. Behind him were 6 other young officers from the department, the task force volunteers who'd been working with community youth programs for months now. "Sir, we wanted you to have this before the meeting starts," Hughes said, handing James a small, wrapped package. James carefully opened it to find a framed photo of himself surrounded by children from the chess club, the young officers and several community elders, all smiling together at last month's neighborhood celebration. Engraved on a small plaque beneath the photo were the words, "Change begins with understanding. Thank you for teaching us both." The auditorium lights flickered, signaling it was time for the meeting to begin. James handed the frame to Lisa and made his way to the stage with Chief Martinez and the mayor. As he settled into his seat, he looked out at the faces watching him, his neighbors, friends, and once strangers now working together. The mayor approached the microphone. "Before we begin reviewing the committee's recommendations, I'd like to ask Colonel James Wilson to say a few words." The crowd applauded as James walked to the podium. He hadn't prepared a speech, didn't think one was necessary. But looking out at all those expectant faces, he knew exactly what needed saying. 6 months ago, on a street I've lived on for 40 years, I was reminded that we still have work to do in this country. But tonight in this room, I'm reminded of something even more important, that we have the will to do that work together.